The sky was bruised with dark clouds as Ranger Tom Larson stood on the overlook, gazing down at the endless stretch of forest below. He'd been a park ranger for over 2 decades, and he thought he knew every twist, every shadowed path of Black Hollow National Park. But there was one area he avoided, a place locals called the Quiet Wood. It had a reputation, though few people in town liked to speak about it. Every time he had to patrol there, something felt wrong. The air seemed thick and almost sour, like the trees were alive and watching. One night, just as he was about to finish his shift, a call came in. A young couple hiking near the Quiet Wood hadn't returned. Their car was still in the lot, their gear untouched. With a grim sense of duty, Tom grabbed his flashlight and set out toward the Quiet Wood. The forest grew darker as he walked. The moon was nearly full, but somehow its light struggled to break through the twisted branches overhead. Tom could hear his own footsteps crunching on the path, and he noticed something odd. There were no other sounds. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing but the wind sighing softly through the trees. The silence was almost oppressive. As he walked deeper, he spotted a flicker of movement on the trail. "Hello?" he called out, his voice swallowed by the eerie silence. He clicked on his flashlight, and the beam fell upon something strange, a tattered backpack snagged on a branch. It looked like it had been there for weeks, maybe months. Tom felt a chill as he moved closer, and he could see faint stains on the fabric. Blood, perhaps. He took a step back, his heart pounding. This was more than just a couple getting lost. He heard a faint sound, a whisper, almost indistinguishable from the wind. Tom froze, scanning the trees around him, but there was no one in sight. The whispering grew louder, like a voice pressing close to his ear. He swung his flashlight around, but the trees stared back, unmoving and silent. It was then he noticed something even stranger. The path he'd been following seemed different, like it had twisted and turned in a way he hadn't noticed. It felt as if the forest itself were shifting around him. He tried his radio, but only static filled his ears. The signal had always been weak here, but this was complete silence, a dead zone. He turned back the way he came, but every path looked the same, every tree a mirror image of the last. It was like the forest was playing tricks on him, trapping him in a maze of shadows. A rustling sound caught his attention, and he swung his light towards it, catching a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was too large to be an animal. The beam of light just missed it, but he saw enough to know he wasn't alone. His heart hammered as he took a step forward, calling out, "Is someone there?" The whispering began again, louder now, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of reach. He turned in circles, trying to locate the source, but it was everywhere, filling the air. Then, out of the darkness, he saw them. A pair of eyes reflecting the beam of his flashlight. They were wide, unblinking, and human. He staggered back, the flashlight shaking in his hand. "Help me," a voice rasped from the shadows. A figure stepped forward, a man with a pale face streaked with grime, his clothes torn and stained. Tom recognized him immediately. It was Josh Hamilton, a hiker who had vanished nearly 2 years ago. "Josh?" Tom whispered, his mouth dry. "How?" The man stepped closer, his movements stiff and unnatural, like he hadn't walked in years. "Please, help me." His voice was a hoarse, unnatural whisper, and as he got closer, Tom noticed the skin on his face. It looked gray, as if he'd been drained of all color, all life. His hands trembled as he reached out toward Tom, his fingers thin and skeletal. Tom stumbled backward, the flashlight slipping from his grip and casting wild shadows as it hit the ground. He tried to turn, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. Behind Josh, other figures were emerging from the trees. Men, women, all pale, gaunt, and staring at him with wide, vacant eyes. They shuffled closer, their movements jerky, as if something was pulling them forward against their will. "Help us," they chanted in unison, their voices blending into a haunting, broken plea. Tom's heart pounded as he picked up his flashlight and ran, stumbling over roots and branches, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast he ran, the chanting followed him, echoing through the trees, getting louder with each step. He tried to retrace his steps, to find the path out of the quiet wood, but everything looked the same. The forest was twisting around him, leading him deeper, pulling him back toward those hollow-eyed figures. He could feel them getting closer, their whispers crawling up his spine, chilling him to the bone. Then the trees opened up into a clearing, and in the center stood an old cabin. It looked ancient, as though it had been there for centuries, forgotten by time. He hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but a flicker of movement in the cabin's window caught his eye. A figure stood there, silhouetted in the pale moonlight, watching him. Desperate, Tom staggered toward the cabin, hoping it might offer some kind of shelter. As he approached, he felt an unnatural chill settle over him. The air was thick, suffocating, and he could hear the whispers all around, louder than ever. He reached the door and pushed it open, stepping into the darkness. Inside, the air was heavy with the stench of decay. The walls were lined with photos, each one a blurry, faded image of a person's face twisted in terror. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the room, and he saw a figure slumped in a corner, barely visible in the shadows. It was the couple he'd been sent to find, their eyes wide open but lifeless, staring at nothing. Their skin was as pale as the others, their bodies frozen in a twisted, unnatural embrace. He backed away, his heart hammering in his chest, but as he turned to leave, he felt a hand close around his arm. He looked down, and there was Josh, his face inches from Tom's, his eyes empty, pleading. "Stay with us," he whispered, his voice a rasping echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The other figures were closing in, their hands reaching out, their eyes fixed on him with an unnatural hunger. He struggled, but their grip was cold and unbreakable, their fingers like iron shackles around his arms, his legs. He tried to scream, but the sound died in his throat as the whispers filled his ears, drowning him in their chilling plea. The next morning, when the sun rose over Black Hollow National Park, a search party found Tom's flashlight lying on the edge of the quiet wood. But there was no sign of Ranger Tom Larson. They searched for days, combing every inch of the forest, but he was never found. Some say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely near the edge of the quiet wood, you can still hear his voice blending with the whispers of the forest, calling out for help, forever lost in the shadows. The park was empty as Ranger Maggie Clark started her evening patrol, but something felt wrong. Black Pine National Forest was beautiful during the day, but at night the place transformed. It was a thick, sprawling forest known for its jagged cliffs, hidden caves, and impenetrable groves. And tonight, Maggie could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, an unease that lingered in the air like mist. Around midnight, Maggie received a strange call on her radio. The voice on the other end was barely audible, just a crackling whisper. She held the radio to her ear, straining to hear, "Help, please." The hollow. Then, silence. She called back, but no one responded. She knew the hollow, a small, sunken area, thick with trees and overgrowth, shrouded by local legends. But the hollow was a good hour's hike from where she was, and who could be out there in the middle of the night? Curiosity outweighed her hesitation, and she made her way down the narrow path toward the hollow, her flashlight cutting a thin beam through the darkness. The forest seemed especially silent tonight, her footsteps muted on the damp ground. It was as if the entire place was holding its breath. She was about halfway there when she noticed a faint light flickering through the trees, almost like a lantern, bobbing gently in the distance. As she moved closer, the light vanished, swallowed by the darkness. She stopped, listening. Faintly, she could hear something, a scraping sound, like metal against rock, somewhere up ahead. She continued forward, her pulse quickening. The air grew colder, and she could feel something watching her, something lurking just beyond her flashlight's reach. When she reached the hollow, she found an old, abandoned campsite. The tents were ripped, shredded as if something had torn through them with claws. The remnants of a fire lay cold and scattered, and broken gear littered the ground. But the strangest thing was the footprints. They were everywhere, but they didn't look human. The prints were long and narrow, with deep, pointed grooves where the toes should be. She bent down, studying them. They looked fresh. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, she heard a low, guttural growl. She froze, shining her flashlight toward the sound, but all she saw were shadows shifting between the trees. The growling grew louder, and she could hear it moving, circling her, always just out of sight. "Maggie," a voice whispered, soft and hollow, right beside her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, a thin, eerie voice that seemed to seep from the ground itself. "Maggie, come to us." She took a step back, her heart pounding, her flashlight shaking in her hand. Then, in the distance, she saw them, figures emerging from the trees, their bodies twisted and elongated, their limbs too long, too thin. They moved in unnatural, jerky motions, their heads lolling to one side, and their faces were covered in masks made of bark and leaves, hollow eyes staring straight at her. Maggie stumbled back, her feet tangling in the torn remains of a sleeping bag. She hit the ground hard, her flashlight skittering away into the dirt, leaving her in darkness. She could hear the figures getting closer, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs as they moved toward her. She crawled toward her flashlight, her fingers shaking, her breathing shallow. As she grabbed the flashlight, she heard a voice behind her, low and inhuman, a voice that sounded like it came from the very roots of the forest. "Why did you come here, Maggie?" It hissed. She turned, shining the light behind her, but all she saw was an empty forest. She scrambled to her feet, backing away from the clearing, her flashlight flickering as she moved. The figures followed, moving faster, their limbs bending at impossible angles, and then she saw what she would never be able to forget. One of them leaned down, its face inches from hers. It removed the bark mask slowly, and beneath it was a face that was disturbingly familiar. Her own. She stared, frozen in horror, at the twisted, dead version of herself, her own hollow eyes staring back at her. A scream tore from her throat as she turned and ran, stumbling through the trees, her own ghostly doppelganger's voice echoing behind her. "Come back, Maggie. We're waiting." She didn't stop running until she reached her truck at the trailhead. Her hands shook so badly she could barely get the keys into the ignition. When she finally did, she sped out of there, never once looking back. The next morning, her supervisor found her parked by the station, pale and shaking, her eyes wide and unfocused. She tried to explain what she'd seen, but the words came out in broken, incoherent fragments. A search party was sent to the hollow, but all they found was an empty clearing, devoid of any tents or gear. But there was one thing they couldn't explain. Scattered across the clearing were footprints, long, narrow, with deep, pointed grooves where the toes should be. Maggie left her job a week later, but she never left the forest entirely. Locals say she wanders the edge of Black Pine National Forest, muttering to herself, her eyes always on the trees. Some say she's looking for something, others that she's waiting. But those who've seen her in recent years tell a darker story. They say she looks different, her face thin and stretched, her limbs too long, her eyes hollow, like something that crawled out of a nightmare. Something that still waits in the hollow, calling out to anyone foolish enough to answer. It was past midnight, and Ranger Ethan Doyle was alone in the heart of Stag's Head National Forest. It had been an unusually quiet night, no hikers, no campers, and most eerie of all, no animals. Even the nocturnal creatures seemed to have vanished, as though the forest was holding its breath. Ethan was on his final patrol of the night, making his way back to the station when he received a distress call over the radio. "Hello?" came the voice, high-pitched and frantic. "Is someone there? We're lost. Please help us. We're near the Devil's Ridge." Ethan's heart sank. Devil's Ridge was the one part of the forest that even the rangers avoided. A sharp, isolated ridge covered in dense fog and jagged rocks, it was filled with legends, disappearances, strange sightings, and ghostly lights. No one was supposed to go up there after dark. He grabbed his flashlight, took a deep breath, and made his way to the trail that led to Devil's Ridge, determined to find whoever was calling for help. As he reached the trailhead, thick fog had already begun to creep in, swallowing the trees in a ghostly haze. The air was cold and damp, heavy with the smell of wet earth and something else, something metallic. Blood? He pressed on, his flashlight illuminating the narrow path. Every step felt like it took him deeper into another world, one that grew darker and stranger with every passing moment. "Hello?" he called out, but only silence replied. He continued up the ridge, the fog thickening around him. Shadows stretched and twisted at the edges of his flashlight's beam, almost as if they were moving on their own. And then he heard it, a faint, dragging sound, somewhere ahead of him. His heart hammered as he picked up his pace, the sound growing louder, closer. Suddenly, he spotted a figure standing just off the trail, a woman in a white dress, her back turned to him. She was completely still, her head slightly tilted as if listening. Ethan swallowed hard, then cleared his throat. "Ma'am, are you the one who called for help?" The woman didn't move. "Ma'am," he called again, stepping closer, but she remained silent, her back to him. He reached out, hesitant, the fog swirling around them, and gently touched her shoulder. In an instant, she spun around and Ethan's blood went cold. Her eyes were wide and empty, reflecting nothing, as if they'd been hollowed out. Her mouth was twisted into a ghastly smile, stretched too wide, her lips cracked and bleeding. She stared at him with that empty gaze, and in a voice that was far too calm, she whispered, "They're waiting for you." Ethan staggered back, nearly tripping over a rock, and as he regained his balance, he saw them. More figures emerging from the fog, all staring at him with those same hollow eyes and twisted smiles. Men, women, children, all silent, all watching him. They stood in a perfect circle surrounding him, their faces blank and lifeless, their eyes like black pits. He turned to run, but his flashlight flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The fog grew thicker, colder, wrapping around him like icy fingers. He could feel them closing in, the sound of their dragging footsteps growing louder, closer. He ran blindly, crashing through the trees, his lungs burning with every breath. The silence was suffocating, broken only by his own ragged breaths and the relentless sound of footsteps following him. Then he saw it. A faint light in the distance, the ranger's station. He sprinted toward it, his legs heavy, his heart pounding, the footsteps still chasing him, echoing through the fog. He burst through the door of the station, slamming it shut behind him, locking it with shaking hands. He slumped against the door, trying to catch his breath, his mind racing. He was safe, he told himself. He was safe. But then he heard it, a soft tapping on the window. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach. Outside, barely visible through the fog, was the woman. Her face was pressed against the glass, her empty eyes fixed on him, her mouth twisted into that grotesque smile. She raised a hand and tapped again, slowly, rhythmically. Ethan backed away from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The tapping grew louder, faster, until it was a rapid, frenzied drumming that seemed to fill the entire station. He covered his ears, his mind screaming in terror, but it didn't stop. The sound was everywhere, surrounding him, growing louder and louder until he thought he might go mad. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The station was silent once more. Ethan lowered his hands, his breath shaky. He looked around, his eyes scanning the room, but there was no one there. No tapping, no figures, just silence. He let out a trembling sigh, relief flooding through him. But as he turned to check the door, he froze. Written in long, jagged scratches across the inside of the window were the words, "Come back to us." He stumbled back, his mind reeling, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He glanced at the door, half expecting the figures to be there, waiting for him, but the room remained empty, eerily still. Over the following days, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Shadows seemed to follow him, lurking at the edges of his vision, vanishing whenever he turned to look. At night, he would wake to hear faint whispers, soft and chilling, coming from the direction of Devil's Ridge. No one else could hear them. No one else believed him. A week later, Ethan disappeared. The rangers who searched for him found only his flashlight, lying at the edge of Devil's Ridge, the glass cracked and covered in dried mud. There was no sign of him anywhere in the forest, no tracks, no clues, just the broken flashlight and an odd circle of disturbed earth around it, as if a dozen people had stood there waiting. To this day, people say that if you stand at Devil's Ridge on a foggy night, you might catch a glimpse of them, the lost souls of the forest, waiting in silence, their hollow eyes watching, waiting for someone to join them. And if you listen closely just beyond the edge of the trees, you might hear a faint whisper, a voice calling from somewhere deep in the fog. It sounds like Ethan's voice endlessly repeating, "Please, help me. They're waiting." The sun had set, casting dark shadows across the thick trees of Willow Creek National Park, and Ranger Bill Turner was finishing up his shift. As he locked up the station for the night, the radio crackled to life with a message from a panicked voice, young and breathless. "Please, help. We saw something. It's following us." The voice was cut off by static. Bill grabbed the radio, tried calling back, but only got silence. He recognized the area the voice had mentioned. Deer Ridge, a dense, quiet part of the forest notorious for unsettling stories among the locals. Deer Ridge was where hikers got lost, where campers heard strange sounds, where animals seemed to vanish. He knew the place well enough to know he shouldn't go alone, but he also knew he couldn't leave anyone stranded out there in the pitch-black darkness. With a deep breath, he grabbed his flashlight and his radio and started down the trail to Deer Ridge, the trees closing in around him like tall, silent sentinels. As he walked, an eerie quiet settled over the forest. There were no animal sounds, no rustling of leaves, just silence. The only sound was his own footsteps on the gravel trail, echoing in the oppressive stillness. Every so often, he'd stop and call out, but only his voice echoed back. After what felt like an hour of searching, he saw it. A faint, dim light flickering deeper into the woods, far off the trail. His pulse quickened as he approached, hoping it was the campers. But as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The light wasn't steady, and it seemed to move and change in odd, irregular ways, almost as if it were breathing. Against his better judgment, he moved off the trail and made his way toward the strange light. It was only when he got close enough that he realized what he was seeing. An old, rusted lantern hanging from a tree branch. Its glass was shattered, and the flame inside burned low and dim, yet it looked as though it had been lit only moments before. He scanned the area around him, but no one was there. No campers, no signs of recent footprints. Just the lantern, swinging slightly in the breeze, casting long shadows across the trees. Then he heard it, the sound of footsteps, soft and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind him. He turned quickly, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but the beam caught nothing but trees. The footsteps stopped, and once again there was only silence. He took a step back, his heart pounding, but as he did, he felt something soft under his boot. He looked down and saw a piece of torn fabric, dirt-stained and frayed, as though it had been snagged and ripped free. He picked it up, examining it under the beam of his flashlight. It was part of a backpack strap, broken and old, with a faded patch sewn on it, a patch he recognized from a missing persons report about a young hiker named Sam Matthews who had disappeared near Deer Ridge over 2 years ago. Bill felt a chill creep over him. He had worked the case, led the searches, spent hours combing the forest, but they had never found any trace of Sam. Yet here it was, lying on the ground as if dropped only moments ago. Suddenly he heard a voice, faint and distant but unmistakable. It was a whisper, trembling and hollow like someone calling from a long way off. "Help, please. Anyone." It was Sam's voice. Bill's blood went cold. His instinct screamed at him to turn back, to head for the trail, but the voice was getting louder, closer, pleading with him. He couldn't ignore it. He moved deeper into the woods, flashlight trembling in his hand, every shadow seeming to reach for him as he walked. The voice continued, growing louder and more desperate, each call pulling him further into the darkness. And then he saw it. Another light, not far ahead, flickering in the dense fog that had begun to rise around him. He called out, his voice shaking, "Sam, is that you?" The light blinked once, twice, as if in response. But it didn't stay still. It began to move, slowly at first, then faster, weaving through the trees, leading him deeper into the forest. He followed it, his heart pounding, until he came to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit cabin, its wood rotted, the windows dark and broken. The light flickered inside, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. Bill took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the light, but something stopped him. A feeling, cold and deep, like he was being watched. He turned, shining his flashlight around the clearing, and that's when he saw them. Figures emerging from the trees, pale and silent, their eyes wide and unblinking. They looked wrong. Their faces were hollow, their skin stretched tight, their bodies thin and twisted, as though they'd been drained of life. And they were all looking at him. He backed away, his flashlight shaking as he stumbled toward the cabin. The figures didn't move, but their eyes followed him, dark and empty, their mouths twisted into faint, unnatural smiles. He pushed open the door to the cabin and stepped inside, slamming it shut behind him. Inside, the light was dim and flickering, casting shadows that danced across the decaying walls. There were objects scattered on the floor, a broken watch, a faded photograph, a torn notebook, all covered in dust. They looked like personal belongings, items left behind. Bill picked up the notebook, brushing off the dirt, and opened it. The pages were filled with frantic, scrawled handwriting, page after page of desperate pleas. "I'm lost, they're watching, they won't let me leave. Please, if anyone finds this." The last page was stained and torn, the handwriting barely legible. "They look like people, but they're not. They want you to join them." A loud creak echoed through the cabin, and Bill looked up, his breath catching in his throat. The door was open, swinging gently, and in the doorway stood one of the figures, staring at him with those hollow, unblinking eyes. "Join us," it whispered, its voice low and raspy, like the rustling of dead leaves. "We've been waiting." Bill backed up, his heart racing, but more figures began to appear, slipping through the walls, emerging from the shadows, their twisted faces watching him, their arms reaching out. He turned and ran, bursting out of the cabin, racing back into the dark forest. The figures followed, their footsteps silent, their movements slow but relentless. He ran blindly, his flashlight flickering, the trees blurring around him. He could still hear the whispering, faint and echoing, growing louder with every step. Finally, he saw the trail, the lights of the ranger station in the distance, and he sprinted toward it, not daring to look back. He didn't stop running until he reached the station, slamming the door shut behind him, gasping for breath. He reported everything, but no one believed him. The next morning, they found the clearing, but there was no cabin, no lights, no sign of any figures. Just empty forest, silent and still. But Bill knew what he'd seen. He could still hear their whispers at night, soft and chilling, calling from the trees. And every so often, hikers would disappear near Deer Ridge, their belongings scattered like offerings in the forest. Rangers would find pieces of torn fabric, broken watches, faded photographs, lying in small clearings, gifts left by something in the forest that waited, watching, always hungry for someone new to join them. Ranger Tom Gallagher had spent 20 years patrolling the trails of Ravenwood National Park, a sprawling stretch of dense woods known for its haunting beauty, and to those who worked there, its disturbing history. Ravenwood had its share of ghost stories, tales of strange sounds, eerie lights, and an unmarked graveyard rumored to be hidden deep in the forest. Tom had never paid them much mind, chalking up the stories to local folklore. But that changed one bitterly cold November night. He was halfway through his night shift when he got a call on his radio. A voice, barely a whisper. It was faint, crackling, but he could just make out the words, "Help, please. Lost." Tom called back, asking for the caller's location, but all he got was static. He tried again, and after a long pause, the voice returned, still faint but unmistakably scared. Near the lake. Don't know where. Please, it's dark." His stomach dropped. Ravenwood's lake was notorious. It was surrounded by steep cliffs and old, twisted trees, a place where no one wandered at night. People said they could hear voices there, echoes of cries for help. But Tom had never seen anything to give the stories credence. Until now. Grabbing his flashlight, he set off down the path toward the lake, radio in hand. As he walked, the forest grew darker and denser, the trees seeming to lean in, their branches clawing at the sky. The air was thick and unnervingly still, and his flashlight barely cut through the dense, cloying fog that had settled along the path. When he finally reached the edge of the lake, he stopped, shining his flashlight across the still water. Nothing but fog and shadows. He called out, his voice sounding small and swallowed by the dark. "Hello? Is anyone out here?" For a moment there was silence, and then he heard it, a soft, distant splash, like something breaking the surface of the water. He aimed his flashlight across the lake, trying to locate the source of the sound, but the fog was too thick. He took a step closer to the water's edge, peering into the mist. Then he saw it, a figure, partially submerged in the lake, just a pale face and shoulders visible above the water, staring at him. It was a woman, her skin ghostly pale, her hair dripping wet and dark, hanging over her face. She was too far out to reach the shore, but she didn't seem to be moving, just floating there, watching him with wide, empty eyes. "Ma'am, are you hurt?" Tom called, his voice echoing across the water. The woman didn't respond. She only continued to stare, her eyes hollow, her lips slightly parted. Then, slowly, she raised one hand out of the water, reaching toward him. A chill ran down Tom's spine. He took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to leave, but he forced himself to stay put. He couldn't just abandon her, he told himself. "I'm coming to help you," he called, stepping closer to the water. But as he reached the edge, he saw something that made him stop cold. Around her in the water, barely visible in the dark, were more faces, dozens of them. Just faint, pale shapes beneath the surface, their eyes open, staring upward. They were floating beneath her, like a field of lilies, their empty eyes fixed on him. Suddenly, the woman let out a low, guttural whisper, her mouth opening wider, her voice barely more than a rasp. "Come closer." Tom felt his legs go weak, his heart hammering in his chest. He wanted to run, to turn and sprint back to the station, but he was frozen, his feet rooted to the ground. Then the woman's hands started to extend toward him, stretching in a way that wasn't natural, her arm elongating like a pale snake reaching across the water. Her mouth opened wider, stretching too far, revealing rows of blackened teeth. Panicking, he stumbled back, tripping over a root and falling to the ground. His flashlight rolled from his hand, casting strange shadows as it spun. He scrambled for it, his hands shaking, and when he managed to grab it, he pointed it back toward the lake. The woman was gone. The surface of the lake was still again, perfectly smooth, as if she had never been there. But then he heard it, the sound of something wet and heavy crawling onto the shore behind him. Slowly he turned, his flashlight trembling in his grip. There on the muddy shore was the woman, her body twisted and contorted, her limbs bent at impossible angles. She moved toward him, pulling herself through the mud with long, jerky movements, her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, her empty eyes locked on him. Tom scrambled to his feet, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs felt heavy, as if he were sinking into the ground. The woman's whisper echoed in his mind, soft and seductive, urging him closer. "Stay with us," she rasped, her voice echoing in his ears, growing louder, filling his mind until he thought he might go mad. With a burst of adrenaline, he managed to break free, stumbling back onto the path, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop running until he reached the ranger station, slamming the door shut behind him, his heart pounding, his mind reeling. For the rest of the night, he stayed locked in the station, clutching his flashlight, jumping at every creak and whisper of wind. When dawn finally broke, he cautiously made his way back to the lake, half convinced that he'd find nothing, that it had all been some terrible dream. But when he reached the shore, he stopped cold. In the mud, right where the woman had crawled toward him, were long, deep grooves, as if something had dragged itself from the water to the shore, and scattered around the lake's edge were footprints, dozens of them, leading in and out of the water. Tom left the job a week later. He never spoke of what he saw, but locals began to notice that no one would go near the lake after dark. Hikers who ventured too close claimed they could hear voices coming from the water, soft and pleading, whispering to them, calling their names. Some say if you stand by the lake on a cold, foggy night, you might see her. The pale woman standing just below the surface, her hand reaching out, waiting for someone to take it. And those who hear her whisper say it stays with them forever. A soft, seductive call that lingers in their dreams, drawing them back to the lake, pulling them deeper into the darkness, until one day they disappear beneath the water, joining the other lost souls in the lake's dark, endless depths. It was late October, and Ranger Aaron Harlow was pulling the graveyard shift at Black Pines State Park. The forest had an ominous reputation, known for its strange occurrences and missing person reports that seemed to spike every year just before Halloween. The rangers often joked that the place was haunted, but Aaron didn't buy into it until one particular night. The air was colder than usual, biting and still. There wasn't a single rustle, no distant owl calls or cricket chirps. Just silence. Aaron was making his rounds in the farthest part of the park, near the old crossroads, a spot avoided by locals and rumored to be a place of thin boundaries, where the line between the living and the dead blurs. His radio crackled with static, and Aaron reached for it, expecting to hear from another ranger. Instead, a faint whispering voice cut through the noise. "Help, please, they won't let me go." The voice was soft and shuddering, and Aaron's hand froze on the radio. He quickly checked his map and saw there were no campers, no hikers scheduled to be in the park that night. His pulse quickened. "Hello?" he called into the radio. "Is someone out there?" Silence. Then a low hum, almost a distant chanting, filled the air, a sound that seemed to seep from the trees themselves. Aaron squinted into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through the thick fog that clung to the ground like smoke. There was something about the way the fog moved, swirling as though alive, forming strange shapes at the edge of his vision that vanished whenever he turned his head. He took a deep breath and continued down the narrow path toward the old crossroads. As he approached, the hum grew louder, a strange rhythmic beat that seemed to pulse with the earth itself. He tried his radio again, but only static replied. Then he saw it. The crossroads clearing, bathed in an unnatural silver light despite the thick clouds that had swallowed the moon hours ago. Standing in the center was a woman, her back turned to him, her long, dark hair hanging over her shoulders. She was motionless, almost blending with the fog, as if she were part of it. "Ma'am," he called, stepping closer. She didn't move. "Are you all right?" The woman slowly turned to face him, and Aaron felt a chill claw its way up his spine. Her eyes were wide and glassy, her skin as pale as bone. But her face was wrong, somehow blurred, as though he were seeing her through water. She reached out a hand, her fingers thin and white, her voice a soft, eerie whisper. "They're coming. They're coming for you, too." Aaron took a step back, his flashlight shaking. He felt the urge to run, but forced himself to stay still. "Who's coming?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The woman's eyes seemed to go even wider, filled with something between fear and sorrow. "They found me, and now they need someone else. You mustn't let them see you." A branch snapped behind him, and Aaron spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the darkness. Nothing was there, but he could feel something watching him from just beyond the trees. His heart pounded, his skin cold with fear. When he turned back, the woman was gone. Only the fog remained, thick and suffocating, swirling around him like smoke from a fire. He backed away, his flashlight casting frantic beams into the fog, illuminating only strange shadows that seemed to follow him, shifting and contorting. Suddenly he heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the silence. He shone his flashlight in the direction of the sound and froze. Emerging from the fog were figures, tall, thin, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their movements slow and rhythmic, almost hypnotic. There were dozens of them, all moving toward him, their forms barely visible through the dense mist. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled back, tripping over a root and landing hard on the ground. The figures continued their advance, silent and relentless, their eyes invisible beneath the dark fabric of their hoods. He scrambled to his feet, heart pounding, his flashlight flickering. "Stay back!" he shouted, but his voice sounded small, swallowed by the fog. The figures came closer, their presence cold and suffocating. Aaron turned and ran, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly as he sprinted back toward the trail. But the fog seemed to thicken around him, the trees twisting and looming, making the path unfamiliar. Every turn seemed to lead him deeper into the forest. And then he heard it again, that soft, rhythmic hum, echoing in his ears as if coming from within him. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, filling his mind, drowning out his thoughts. He covered his ears, but the sound only grew stronger as though the forest itself were singing. He stopped, gasping for breath, and looked around. He was back at the crossroads clearing, the place he'd been desperately trying to escape. The figures surrounded him now, forming a perfect circle, their eyes hidden, their faces blank and hollow. The fog swirled around them, thick and suffocating, pressing in from all sides. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, soft and mournful. They need someone else. As he looked around, he realized with a cold, sinking horror what that meant. The figures, the spirits, the watchers, they weren't here to harm him. They were here to take him, to pull him into whatever dark realm they inhabited, to make him one of them. The chanting grew louder, filling the air, pressing in on him until he couldn't breathe, couldn't think. He dropped to his knees, his flashlight slipping from his hand, the light dying as the batteries finally gave out. In the darkness, he felt cold hands reach out, pulling him down, their touch freezing, empty, relentless. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the fog, swallowed by the hum that now surrounded him, filled him, became part of him. When the sun rose the next morning, Ranger Aaron Harlow was gone. His radio and flashlight were found at the crossroads, lying in the center of the clearing, their surfaces covered in frost despite the mild weather. No sign of him was ever found. To this day, other rangers avoid the crossroads at night, but every so often, on foggy October evenings, they claim to hear a faint, rhythmic hum echoing through the trees, like distant chanting. And sometimes, if they listen closely, they can hear something else, a single soft voice, whispering for help, calling for someone to join them. Those who venture too close to the old crossroads at night say they can see shadows in the fog, tall, hooded figures standing just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. And if you stand there long enough, they say, you might feel a hand on your shoulder, cold as ice, pulling you into the fog, where you'll join the others who never found their way back. Ranger Dana Lowell had seen a lot in her years at Bitterwood Forest Preserve, but she'd never felt real fear until the night she received a call from the deadline. Every ranger knew about it. A certain frequency on the radio, channel 13.5, was a strange glitch, an in-between signal that no one used, yet it would occasionally crackle to life, usually in the dead of night. No one knew how, but somehow, messages came through. Only the most seasoned rangers believed the stories, passed down as an unspoken rule. If you hear the deadline, don't answer. But that night, alone at the watchtower with a storm rolling in, Dana's radio began to hum with static, a faint crackling voice cutting through, and without thinking, she reached for the receiver. Help. Anyone there? The voice was barely a whisper, but she could hear the desperation. Dana frowned. This is Ranger Dana Lowell. I hear you. What's your location? Static filled the line again, but the voice returned, louder this time. North Ridge, please, don't leave me here. They're coming. Dana's stomach tightened. North Ridge had been closed for nearly 5 years after a series of tragic incidents. Hikers disappearing only to turn up miles away, lost and delirious. Many never returned, and those who did came back changed, their minds shattered, their memories erased. Stay where you are. I'm coming, Dana said, her voice steady, even though every instinct told her not to go. She knew better. She'd heard the warnings. But the voice was so real, so frightened. She grabbed her flashlight and rain jacket, locked up the tower, and headed out into the storm. The rain pounded down as she climbed the ridge trail, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. She kept her radio on, hoping to hear the voice again to get a better idea of the caller's location. But instead, there was only silence. She was about halfway up when the air changed. It was subtle at first, just a chill, like the temperature had dropped. But soon it became more than that. The rain slowed, but the air grew thick, heavy, with a strange metallic smell, like iron or blood. Her flashlight flickered, and she stopped, shining it ahead. That's when she saw him. A figure stood just off the trail, barely visible in the shadows. His clothes were tattered, soaked, and his face was pale, almost translucent. But it was his eyes that stopped her cold. They were wide, unblinking, and filled with a terrible emptiness. Are you the one who called? She asked, her voice shaking. The figure nodded slowly, but he didn't move, didn't speak. She took a cautious step forward, shining her light on him. Are you hurt? What's your name? But before he could answer, his mouth opened and a horrible sound escaped, a rasping, wet gasp that was barely human. His mouth twisted as though he were trying to speak, but no words came. And then she saw it. His mouth wasn't moving on its own. Something was inside, pressing against his lips, trying to get out. Dana's stomach lurched as she realized what she was seeing. She took a step back, her flashlight shaking. But the figure's eyes suddenly locked onto hers, his mouth stretching wider, the gasping sound growing louder, more desperate. Without thinking, Dana turned and ran, her heart pounding as she bolted back down the trail. But the rain grew heavier, the air thicker, and soon she couldn't tell if she was even on the path anymore. The trees loomed, twisted shapes that seemed to reach out for her, their branches clawing at her, tearing at her jacket. Her radio crackled to life again, the same voice coming through, now louder, frantic. They're inside me. Please, I can't. The voice broke off, replaced by heavy, shuddering breaths and a sickening, wet sound. Dana stumbled, gripping the radio, and looked around, disoriented, barely able to see through the thick rain. But she heard something moving in the trees. Footsteps, heavy and slow, getting closer. Desperate, she fumbled for her flashlight, shining it back down the path. That's when she saw them, figures emerging from the trees, dozens of them, their faces pale and lifeless, their mouths twisted open in silent screams. Some of them were missing eyes or limbs, their skin torn and frayed, but all of them had the same hollow, empty gaze, and all of them were moving toward her. She turned and sprinted down the trail, her lungs burning, her feet slipping on the wet ground. But no matter how fast she ran, the figures were always just behind her, close enough that she could hear their labored breaths, their wet, rasping whispers. Finally, she reached a clearing, a small, open space where the trees seemed to pull back. She stopped, gasping for breath, her heart pounding as she looked around, searching for any sign of escape. But the figures were closing in, their dead eyes fixed on her. She reached for her radio, her hands shaking, and called out, "Is anyone there? Please, I need help." But the only response was static, followed by a low, whispering voice. "They found you. They always find you." The whispering grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts, until all she could hear was that soft, insidious voice, chanting over and over. And then, in a flash of lightning, she saw him, the man from before, standing just behind the others, his face twisted in agony, his mouth open in a silent scream. His eyes locked onto hers, and she realized with a sickening dread that he was trying to warn her, to tell her to run. But it was too late. The figures moved in, their pale hands reaching out, pulling her down, their hollow eyes staring, mouths opening wider and wider until the world went dark. The next morning, they found her flashlight lying in the clearing, the glass cracked, her radio broken, its battery drained. There was no sign of her, no tracks, no evidence that she'd ever been there. The park rangers called off the search after a few days, marking her down as another casualty of the mysterious disappearances that plagued Bitterwood. But every so often, late at night, rangers working the graveyard shift report hearing something strange on channel 13.5, a faint, crackling voice calling out for help, always breaking off before they can respond. And those who dare to listen say they can still hear her voice on the radio, whispering, "They found me. They'll find you too." And every year, like clockwork, another ranger vanishes from Bitterwood Forest, leaving only the echo of their final call, lost in the static of the deadline. Ranger Eli Stanton had heard all the legends about Boulder Ridge. It was an isolated region of Black Hollow National Forest, a place that rangers only patrolled once a month, and always in pairs. They called it the place that watches, because no matter where you were in that dense, labyrinthine stretch of forest, it always felt like someone or something was watching you. One evening, Eli was finishing a routine patrol when he spotted a faint glow deep in the woods, far off the main path. There shouldn't have been any campers out there. It was well past curfew, and permits to stay overnight in Boulder Ridge had been suspended. Curious and a bit uneasy, he decided to investigate. As he approached, he saw the flickering light was coming from an old campsite, though the fire was barely smoldering, emitting weak tendrils of smoke that wound up into the thick canopy above. Around the campsite, items were scattered, empty bags, torn clothes, and what looked like a journal lying open on a rock. Eli called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" His voice echoed, hollow in the silence. No answer, but as he stepped closer to inspect the area, a strange feeling washed over him. The woods were too quiet. Even the usual night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, were completely absent. He picked up the journal and flipped through it, his flashlight illuminating shaky, hurried handwriting. The last few entries were scrawled messily, some words barely legible, but the tone was unmistakably frantic. "Saw them again last night, shadows moving between the trees. Can't tell if they're real or just my mind playing tricks on me. No sleep, eyes in the trees, they're watching me. I don't think I'm alone. I can hear whispers just out of reach. If anyone finds this, please stay away from Boulder Ridge." Eli felt a shiver crawl down his spine. He set the journal down, eyes scanning the surrounding woods. He had an overwhelming sense that he shouldn't be here, that he needed to leave. But his instincts as a ranger kept him rooted. Someone might need help. Then he noticed something odd on the ground. A trail of footprints leading away from the camp. They were deep, erratic, as though the person had been running. Without fully knowing why, he started to follow them, each step carrying him deeper into the forest, further from the main trail and into Boulder Ridge's untouched, shadowed heart. The deeper he went, the colder the air grew, until his breath came out in white puffs, hanging in the air like ghostly smoke. The footprints led to a cluster of trees that formed a natural archway, thick with hanging moss and twisted branches. As he passed under the arch, his radio crackled. Static. Then a voice, barely a whisper. "Eli, leave." He froze. His hand shot to the radio and he called back, "Who is this?" Only silence. Then more static and a faint, almost pleading whisper. "They're coming." The voice faded and the silence returned, thicker than ever. Eli was about to turn back when he heard a sound, a low, shuffling noise, like someone dragging their feet through the underbrush. "Hello?" he called, his voice thin in the oppressive stillness. And then he saw them. Figures emerging from between the trees, barely visible in the dim light of his flashlight. They moved slowly, their bodies shifting unnaturally with jerky, disjointed movements. Their eyes, wide and vacant, glowed faintly, reflecting the light in a way that no human eyes should. One of the figures took a step closer, its head tilted as though studying him. Eli's heart pounded as he took a step back, but the figure's lips moved, though its voice sounded far away, distant, like it was coming from underwater. "Leave before they take you too." Ely's blood ran cold. He recognized the face. It was the ranger who had disappeared last year. No trace of him had ever been found. The search had gone on for weeks before he was presumed dead. And now, here he was, standing before Eli, his skin pale, his clothes torn and muddied, his eyes hollow, empty. Before he could react, more figures emerged from the shadows, all staring at him with the same blank, haunting expression. Some of them he recognized as missing hikers, faces he'd seen on posters pinned around the station, each one listed as lost without a trace. They moved closer, forming a circle around him, their eyes fixed, their mouths opening in silent screams. Eli backed away, his hand fumbling for his flashlight. The figures grew closer, and the air grew thick with whispers, urgent, pleading, warning him to leave, to run. But his legs felt heavy, rooted to the ground. He tried to turn, but it was as though the forest itself was holding him, binding him in place. The missing ranger reached out a hand, his eyes filled with something beyond horror, something beyond death. "They won't let you go," he whispered, his voice a rasping echo. "They took us. They'll take you too." And then, in a blur of movement, the figures surged forward, their hands reaching, their eyes wide and empty, their faces contorted in pain and despair. Eli stumbled back, his flashlight flickering, the shadows swallowing the beam of light as the figures closed in. He ran, tearing through the trees, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The voices grew louder, the whispers turning to wails, filling his ears, drowning out his thoughts. The shadows seemed to stretch, twisting, pulling him back, dragging him deeper into the forest. Finally, he burst through the trees, stumbling onto the main trail, his flashlight slipping from his grasp. He fell to his knees, gasping for breath, his hands shaking. The whispers faded, the figures retreating into the dark woods, but their eyes lingered in his mind, empty and pleading, calling him back. Eli staggered back to the ranger station, his face pale, his hands still trembling. He tried to tell his supervisor what he'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. And in his heart, he knew they wouldn't believe him. No one ever did. That night, as he sat alone in his cabin, he heard it. The faint, crackling sound of his radio, whispering his name, calling him back to Boulder Ridge. He turned it off, but the whispers continued, filling the silence, creeping into his mind. And every night since, as he lies in bed, he hears them. Voices pleading, desperate, calling for help, calling him back. Ranger James Alden was a skeptic by nature. He didn't believe in ghost stories, and he wasn't one to be shaken by eerie campfire tales. But even he couldn't deny the strangeness of the Lake Moonlight incident, a night that haunted him every day since it happened. Lake Moonlight was beautiful by day, with its crystal-clear waters reflecting the sky and dense, towering pines framing it perfectly. But by night, it was something else. The locals warned about the lake, claiming it changed after dark, as if something ancient lurked beneath its surface, waiting for the sun to set. Rangers like James were told to stay clear of the lake after sundown, but the reason was never explained. It was just strongly advised. One quiet October night, just before the camping season came to a close, James was patrolling the trails when his radio crackled to life. He wasn't expecting a call this late, especially from the deserted area near the lake. "Ranger Base, this is Ranger Alden. I'm hearing a transmission. Anyone there?" he said, speaking into his receiver. A pause, and then a voice came through, faint and static-filled. "Please, I'm lost by the water. They're here." The voice sent a chill down his spine. It was just a whisper, barely audible, but it was clear enough to understand. He'd been the only ranger on duty that night, and no campers were scheduled. But something in the voice was wrong. He couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, or even if it was entirely human. It was distorted, hollow, like it was traveling through water to reach him. Against his better judgment, he grabbed his flashlight and headed for the lake. The forest was dark and silent, and as he neared the shore, an uneasy feeling crept over him. The trees seemed to loom closer, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers, reaching out to ensnare him. He kept his eyes focused ahead, resisting the urge to look around. As he approached the shore, he saw something strange on the water. A faint glow spread across the lake, pale and like moonlight. Only the sky was overcast, and there was no moon visible. The glow shimmered, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the surface, and James thought he saw movement beneath the water, something dark and sinuous, like shadows writhing just beneath the surface. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing. "Is anyone out here?" Silence. Then a faint splashing sound came from the edge of the lake. He turned his flashlight toward the sound and froze. A figure was standing knee-deep in the water, their back turned to him, head tilted down. The figure's clothes were soaked and clinging to them, and their hair hung in long, wet strands. James felt a pang of relief. Maybe it was just a lost hiker after all. He took a step forward. "Hey, are you all right?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't respond, didn't even seem to notice him. They just stood there, swaying slightly, as if entranced by the glowing water. But as James stepped closer, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Their feet weren't touching the lake bed. They were hovering just above the surface, perfectly still despite the faint ripples of the water below. The figure's head slowly began to turn, the movement unnatural, jerky, like a puppet on strings. As the face came into view, James's breath caught. It was blank, featureless, except for two hollow eyes that seemed to go on forever, dark and empty, as though they led somewhere far beyond this world. The figure's mouth opened, and the voice from the radio returned, warped and echoing, as though it were calling from miles away. "Help! They're here. They're always here." Without thinking, James took a step back, his instincts screaming at him to turn and run. But as he moved, the figure's eyes locked onto his, filled with a strange, desperate recognition, as if it had been waiting for him all along. And then he noticed something in the water. Shapes were rising from the depths, silent and slow. They were bodies, pale, bloated, their faces twisted in expressions of eternal terror. Their arms were outstretched, reaching toward the surface, their empty eyes fixed on him, just like the figure on the shore. They floated just beneath the water's surface, moving closer, drawn toward him as if pulled by some unseen force. James stumbled back, his flashlight flickering, but he was frozen in place, paralyzed by this of the bodies rising, filling the lake until there was no clear water left, only a writhing mass of pale limbs and hollow, staring eyes. The figure on the shore began to move toward him, gliding across the water, its blank face twisting into a ghastly smile, the edges of its mouth stretching wider than should have been possible, revealing rows of jagged, inhuman teeth. The voice grew louder, filling his mind, echoing in every corner of his thoughts. "They're waiting for you to join them." The words echoed, growing louder and louder until they were a chorus of voices all calling out to him, pleading, demanding, "Join us! Join us!" James turned and ran, the voices chasing him, filling the night air with their tortured wails. He didn't stop until he reached the ranger station, slamming the door behind him and collapsing on the floor, gasping for breath. The lake patrol was officially closed the following day. The ranger supervisor marked it off as a simple glitch in the radio transmission, claiming James must have misheard, that he'd been out in the woods too long. But James knew what he'd seen, and he refused to go near Lake Moonlight ever again. Yet sometimes late at night, when he's alone and the world is silent, his radio will crackle with faint static, and he'll hear a voice he recognizes, warped and distant, calling his name, pleading, "Help! They're here. They're always here." And when he dares to look out his window toward the lake, he swears he can see them standing on the shore, pale, silent figures with hollow eyes, waiting, always waiting for someone to join them. Ranger Sarah Whitmore didn't believe in curses, and she certainly didn't buy into the folklore surrounding the Blackwood Swamp. But even she couldn't ignore the stories of strange lights and the eerie sounds that had plagued the area for generations. Locals swore that the swamp was haunted, that it claimed anyone who wandered too deep. Sarah shrugged it off as superstition, until the night she was forced to confront it herself. It was a late autumn evening when Sarah received a call about a missing hiker. The man had been camping nearby but hadn't returned. His friends reported him missing after he had supposedly gone toward the swamp, claiming he'd heard a strange, rhythmic singing drifting from that direction. He'd insisted on finding the source, even though his friends had urged him not to go. With the sun already setting and the fog creeping in, Sarah felt a prickle of unease as she approached the swamp. The mist was thick, curling around the gnarled trees, and the swamp itself looked like a place forgotten by time, dark, overgrown, with twisted roots and brackish water. There was no trail here, only patches of moss-covered ground and thick, stagnant pools that stretched on, seemingly endless. She called out, her voice echoing back to her. "Hello? Ranger Whitmore here, is anyone there?" Only silence. Then, just as she was about to turn back, she heard it. A faint, haunting melody drifting through the mist, soft and strange. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic, like a lullaby sung by a distant voice, but there was something unsettling about it, a sadness that seemed to seep into her bones. She couldn't understand the words, but she was drawn to it, like the melody was calling her deeper into the swamp. "Hello?" she called again, her voice weaker this time, her curiosity battling with her growing fear. She took a few steps forward, her boots sinking slightly into the mud, her flashlight casting an eerie glow over the water. Then she saw movement. A figure was standing in the shadows, barely visible through the fog. It was a woman, her clothes tattered and soaked, her skin pale and ghostly under the moonlight. Her eyes were wide, fixed on Sarah, filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and warning. "Are you lost?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. But as she took another step, her flashlight flickered and the figure faded, blending into the mist until it was gone. She felt a chill run down her spine, but the melody continued, growing louder, echoing around her in a haunting, rhythmic pattern. It was coming from deeper in the swamp, drawing her closer, and despite her fear, she found herself moving toward it, her feet carrying her forward, as though something unseen was guiding her. The ground grew softer, and soon she was stepping through water up to her ankles, the mud pulling at her boots with every step. The fog thickened, closing in around her until she could barely see her own hand in front of her. The song was louder now, almost urgent, as if pleading for her to come closer, to listen. And then she heard another sound, a soft, splashing noise, like someone moving through the water nearby. She turned, shining her flashlight around, but there was no one there, only shadows and fog, shifting and swirling, twisting into strange, unearthly shapes that seemed to watch her from the darkness. Suddenly, her radio crackled and a distorted voice came through. "Sarah, turn back." She froze. The voice sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it. She brought the radio to her mouth, her hand shaking. "Who is this?" Only static. Then, faintly, the voice returned. "Don't go. They're waiting." And then the melody changed. The song, once hauntingly beautiful, grew dark, discordant, the notes clashing in a way that set her nerves on edge. The sadness was gone, replaced by something cold, something hungry. She tried to turn back, but her feet felt heavy, as though the mud were pulling her down, dragging her deeper into the swamp. And then she saw them. Figures began to rise from the water, their faces pale and bloated, eyes wide with a hollow, desperate look. They moved slowly, wading through the water toward her, their mouths open, as though they were trying to scream, but no sound escaped. Their arms reached out, hands clawed and twisted, fingers elongated and waterlogged, grasping at the air. She recognized some of them, faces she'd seen on missing persons posters at the ranger station. Hikers, campers, people who had gone missing over the years, their bodies never found. And now here they were, their eyes filled with terror, their expressions frozen in a silent scream. One of them was the missing hiker she'd been sent to find. His eyes locked onto hers, and he opened his mouth, but instead of words, only a low, guttural moan escaped, filled with despair. He reached out, his fingers brushing her arm, cold and slimy, and she stumbled back, her heart racing. "Please, don't," he whispered, his voice barely audible, like he was fighting against something that controlled him. "Don't. Listen to them." Sarah's flashlight flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows across the water. She turned, desperate to run, but the swamp seemed to shift around her, closing her in, trapping her. The figures continued to move closer, their dead eyes fixed on her, their expressions twisted in a mixture of terror and longing, as if they were begging her to join them. The song grew louder, filling her mind, drowning out her thoughts, pulling her into a trance. She stumbled, the water up to her knees now, her feet sinking deeper with every step. The figures surrounded her, their hands reaching, cold and wet, brushing against her, pulling her down. She felt something wrap around her ankle, a root, twisting and coiling, dragging her down into the water. She struggled, kicking and pulling, but it held tight, stronger than any root should be, like it was alive, pulsing with a dark, unnatural energy. The figures watched, their eyes wide, their mouths open in silent screams as she sank deeper, the cold water closing over her. And just as the last bit of air escaped her lungs, she saw the woman from before, standing on the shore, watching her with sorrowful eyes. The woman raised a hand, as though in farewell, and then turned, disappearing into the fog. The next morning, her fellow rangers found her flashlight lying at the edge of the swamp, its beam still flickering weakly. Her radio lay beside it, hissing with static. But there was no sign of Sarah. The locals whispered that she'd been claimed by the swamp, that the spirits had taken her, just like the others. And sometimes, on quiet, misty nights, if you stand by the shore and listen carefully, you can hear her voice mingling with the others, singing that same haunting melody, calling out, luring anyone who dares to listen, into the depths of Blackwood Swamp, where the lost wait in silence, forever watching, forever longing for someone to join them.